I'm really happy to be here this evening to be able to talk with you about a few bits and pieces of a project that I've been involved with for more than 20 years. And there are so many findings out of this study that I just think are fascinating, not that I'm biased in any way. But I'm going to pick a couple of them that I think are particularly relevant to the themes of this speaker series and the idea of getting involved and getting engaged. And both of the elements that I talk about this evening are relevant not only to how long you live, the quantity of your life, but also to the quality of your life. And whenever I talk about longevity, I have people saying, well, I don't want to live a long life if I have to give up all the things that are fun and interesting. And it's very clear in our data that the things that make you live longer also are the things that make life worth living, at least in my view. So let's get started, and I'll tell you a little bit about the Terman Life Cycle Project. It started in the early 1920s, 1921, 1922. Lewis Terman and his colleagues, most of them research assistants, they were going around to schools, mostly in the San Francisco and Los Angeles areas, and gathering up smart kids. Terman, you might be familiar with his name. He helped translate and adapt the Stanford-Binet IQ test for use here in the United States. But he was really concerned about the way the country was going, and that's always a concern. But even back in the 20s, he felt like we were losing our edge, that we might no longer be producing leaders and people who were going to make a difference in the world. And so his goal in trying to identify all these smart kids was to try to track and identify early in life who might be leaders and inventors and people who would do great things, with the idea that if we could identify early, we could groom and we could really make those people into great things even more than would have happened naturally. It's also interesting, though, at that time in our history, there was a pretty common view, which was that if you were too smart, that really wasn't working in your favor, that you were likely, if that was encouraged in you, to grow up to be a sort of a maladjusted, sickly, egg-headed kind of creature. And so parents were being told, if you've got a smart kid, don't encourage that too much. Don't have them read too much. Make them go outside and play and be normal. And certainly play is important for kids, and they shouldn't be inside all the time. But Terman really didn't believe that it was bad to be smart. And so he aimed to follow these kids into adulthood, not only to see if they became leaders and inventors and did great things, but also to demonstrate his hypothesis, which was that they would be fine and normal and it wasn't bad to be smart. So they went out into these schools and they had teachers identify who the teacher thought was the smartest kid in the class. And then they also got the youngest kid in the class because they thought maybe that kid would have skipped a grade or something. And then they IQ tested them, and every child who reached a criterion IQ was invited, or their parents were invited to have them be in this study. So there were about 1,528 of them. They were not ethnically diverse, so they were almost all white. They were mostly middle class, so not a lot of socioeconomic status variability. One thing that I'm very grateful for, because nobody really studied girls or women in the 20s, the sample is almost half girls or women. So 672 of the 1,528 were female. And Terman and his colleagues did a very extensive set of data collection at that inception. Doctors actually examined all the kids, parents and teachers made reports, kids answered questions, and then every 5 to 10 years, these kids were followed up, and they answered questions. They sometimes did interviews. They filled out questionnaires. When they got married, their spouses filled out questionnaires. So there's a lot of data available on these participants. When I started graduate school in 1991, there was almost no information about how long people had lived and what they had died of. So one of the big things that took us a long time was to try to follow up and get death certificates for all of these people. And that's really important, but something that, because they had spread out over the US, many of them stayed in California, but many of them did not, it was kind of a job to gather all these death certificates. But the study hadn't been designed to look at health outcomes. So Terman had his interests, and what we were really interested in doing was expanding his study and using the data he collected, because there were over 4,000 variables on every single one of these people. So a very rich source of data. And we wanted to try to figure out what predicts mortality risk or what predicts longevity. And what are the pathways through which that happens? What are the personality characteristics that are important? What are the behaviors, the social interactions, the jobs? What makes a difference? And so that was our task. And what you can see up here on the left is Louis Terman. There actually are only, I think, a couple of photos of him publicly available. And then you see pictures of the archives. So even though a lot of the data were already computerized by the time we started working with it, a lot of other things were not. And so every participant has at Stanford, either in the basement or the attic, a file. Some of them have 2 or 3 files in these file cabinets. And so if we wanted certain pieces of data, we would make a trip up there and stay for 2 or 3 days and plow through all of these. And it was a lot of fun, and it was really frustrating, because to try to stay on task and look for maybe 10 variables and not get distracted by the letters and the pictures and the newspaper clippings and all the other stuff that was in there was pretty tough to do. But we persevered, and we did get the data that we needed. Oh, there's also really big rat traps up there that were a little scary the first time, but we got used to that too. Okay. So I want to start by telling you about a couple of people. So most of these 1,528 people, of course, are not publicly identified, and so we can't talk about them by name or give identifying details. But there were several of them who were very proud to be in the study and who did publicly identify. And so Ansel Keys is one of those. And I chose him as an example because he lived a very interesting life. He worked hard. He had a lot of different jobs. He worked on a ship for a while. He cut wood for a while. When he started functioning as a scientist, he initially was interested in survival in cold, well, harsh conditions, but mostly really cold conditions, and calorie-restricted diets, and how that, what happened to metabolism. And so he had a lot of interesting and diverse areas that he looked at. He was asked by the government to create a nutritionally complete complement of meals that soldiers could eat out in the field. And so that you see there on the bottom left, the K ration. And he liked to say that it was named after him. It was K ration for keys. There's no evidence that that's actually the case. I think the military just kind of assigns letters to stuff, but he liked to say it was named after him. He might be best known for his promotion of what I guess we would call today a Mediterranean diet. It wasn't called that then, but basically arguing for eating more fresh things, a more plant-based diet. And he was doing that a long time before it was recognized as important and before it was popular. He worked incredibly hard. He had a good deal of stress. He got criticism, particularly for a lot of the stuff that he said about dietary intake and how that was important to cardiovascular health. So worked hard, had stress, and yet was very, very passionate about what he did. So he has some things in common with the second person that I want to tell you about, and that is Shelley Smith Mydans. She was amazing. She was a reporter, so she was all over the world. She did a lot of reporting in Europe. She was in Asia and the Pacific. She married photographer Carl Mydans, and they both worked for Life magazine. And so she's probably best known for her work with Life magazine. During World War II, she was captured in the Philippines, in Manila. And she spent about 2 years in a prisoner of war camp. And during that time, one of her tasks was to every day pick the weevils out of the food that they were going to eat. And I guess maybe when you're in a POW camp, you're grateful to have food, even if it's got weevils in it. When she was finally released as part of a prisoner exchange, she went right back to reporting. In her spare time, she wrote novels. She and her husband had kids. Again, a stressful life, a very hard-working life, a long career, a lot of productive and creative outlets outside of that. And these two people, I think, are good exemplars of the kind of lifestyle that maybe some of your parents warned you about. I know my parents have said to me, I can't even count how many times they have said, you need to slow down, you need to relax, you need to not work so hard, you're working yourself into an early grave. And I always believed that. And I always thought, yeah, I need to slow down a little bit. I need to finish this one project first, and I've got this other thing that I'm really excited about. But then, yeah, you're right, I need to slow down. Well, what we found in the longevity project, and the way that we did the analyses is, well, we conducted what's called a survival analysis. So you're essentially looking at the relative risk of dying at any given point in time by virtue of being a member of a particular group versus another group. And so we looked at different characteristics, and one of the things we found is that the people who worked really hard and who oftentimes were pretty stressed in their jobs, that wasn't harmful to them. And in fact, those people lived the longest. So it kind of flies in the face of my parents' advice to slow down, take it easy, you'll work yourself into an early grave. So you're probably wondering why you have a pencil and paper. We're going to have a quiz to make sure you are listening. No, I'm kidding. We're not. But we are going to use the pencil and paper. What I want to do is give you a brief assessment. So with that, I'm going to have, I think, 4 slides with some questions, and I'll actually read them just in case they're not clear from the back of the room. And then I just want you to pick your answer for each one, and then we're going to add some things up at the end. So number 1, when I work, my productivity is high. If that's occasionally true of you, choose 1. If it's sometimes true, pick 2. If it's often true, pick 3. If it's almost always true, pick 4. Number 2, I feel that my work is meaningful. Occasionally 1, sometimes 2, often 3, almost always 4. Number 3, an important goal of my life is to reach the point where I can stop working and relax for a change. Number 1, it's the most important goal. If it's a very important goal, 2. It's a moderately important goal, 3. Or it's a minor goal, 4. If it's not a goal at all, pick 4. Okay, number 4, my success depends on my efforts, not on luck. I feel this way once in a while, 1. I feel this way about half the time, 2. I often feel this way, 3. Or almost always feel this way, 4. Number 5, there is still a lot that I want to accomplish. Well, if your view is, I've accomplished enough, now I can relax, 1. There are only a few things I still want to do, 2. There are some things I still want to do, 3. Or absolutely, I still have many goals, 4. Number 6, in the past decade, I have received special honors or awards. No, I am never singled out for special accomplishments. That's 1. No, I'm usually not that willing or able to be singled out for achievement, 2. Yes, my efforts and contributions are sometimes specially recognized, 3. Or 4, yes, I often receive such recognition. Okay. Number 7, in whatever I do, I aspire to excellence much more than do my colleagues. Not really, 1, sometimes 2, most of the time 3, or definitely 4. Number 8, being given promotions, more responsibility, and so on is under the control of people who are in charge and not under my control. Not at all true, 1. Maybe true, 2. Probably true, 3. Definitely true, 4. Number 9, I am passionate about the job that I do. And by job here, whatever it is that you spend a lot of your time doing, even if you're retired. 1, not really. 2, partly. 3, mostly. Or 4, without a doubt, you're passionate. Okay. So you'll notice as you went through that list that the questions weren't all asking the same thing. They were asking about different aspects. How important are things? How much do you get recognized? How hard do you work? There was a variety of elements. And so even though those are all somewhat different, they do hold together pretty well as a scale. So if you correlate all of those items, they have a high what's called an internal consistency reliability. They relate well with one another. And so when we look at the scale, which assesses the degree to which you are actively engaged and getting rewarded by the things that you do in your life, about 25% of people, the upper quartile, score at above 25. You could have a score as high as 36, but about a quarter of people are 25 or higher. And the lowest quartile are going to score around 16 and below. So you can use those numbers to sort of gauge, do you tend to be higher than most people? Are you lower than most people? Are you kind of in the middle? This is important because what we found is that even though people who score pretty high tend to be people that do experience some stress as a part of what they do because they're engaging and they're working hard and they're doing a lot, they also experience satisfaction, and they feel rewarded by what they do. They believe that what they do is important. And so even if something is being taken away, and I'm not entirely sure that it is, there's a difference between eustress, the good stress, and distress, the bad stress. But even if there's a bit being taken away by some stress, there's enough of a counter benefit to take care of that and even to compensate beyond that and to improve health outcomes. So that, I think, is really exciting. Now, I should be clear that the kind of stress and hard work that we're talking about here, and this is what people tended to experience that were on the high end of the scale in our study as well, we're talking about stress and hard work that's involved in pursuing outcomes. So we're not talking about like interpersonal stress, like you have a boss or someone that you can't get along with, things that are really out of your control, and things that are of an interpersonal nature. If you have a job that you hate, I'm not suggesting that working harder at it and letting it be even more stressful is going to be good for your health. But for people who have some stress because they're taking on things that they really care about and that they're passionate about, our data really suggests that that's not only okay to do, it's probably a beneficial thing to do. And that's consistent with a lot of the other literature out there too, suggesting that staying engaged, being active in one's community and all of that kind of stuff is important, not only early in life, but during aging as well. So we've been focusing on work. I want to shift gears a little bit now to another approach, and that is social relationships. So how do we engage with others as opposed to engaging with tasks? And I'm going to ask you another series of questions, and then that'll be the last series, I promise. But they're going to be about how you engage with others and what your social networks are like. Not your Facebook social networks or whatever other social networks, but the real people social networks. So, number 1, how often in a typical month do you talk to a lot of different people at gatherings? Never, and then any number up to 4 or more times. So give yourself a 0 if you had never. Number 2, how often in the past month have you participated in group meetings or activities other than work meetings? Again, never to 4 or more times. Okay, number 3, of your friends, how many could you definitely call on for help if you needed it? None. That'll be your 0, all the way up to 4 or more. Number 4, How many relatives do you see or hear from at least once per month? None, all the way up to 4 or more. Number 5, how many people in your life accept you totally just as you are? None, all the way up to 4 or more, but just give yourself a 4. Number 6, how often in the past month have friends or relatives made you feel loved and cared for? 0, all the way up to 4. Number 7, how many people can you count on to help you feel better when you're down in the dumps? 0 to 4. Number 8, how often in the past month have others talked to you about important decisions they needed to make? Never, to 4 or more. Number 9, how often in the past week have you helped others beyond your partner or children with tasks that they needed to do? And that can be advice giving to driving someone. It can cover a broad range of things, but it shouldn't be your immediate family members, other people. Never, up to 4 or more times. Number 10, how many people, including children, friends, parents, neighbors, whoops, I have a typo, rely on you to do something important for them every day? And again, important is, it's important to them. It's broadly construed. None, up to 4 or more. All right. Now this is more complicated scoring than the last one. You can actually just add them all up, but I'm more interested in the subscales. So if you do add everything up, you're going to skip number 1. So you can just cross off the first thing. Psychologists are tricky, and sometimes they just put in filler items, and that's what we did. So that first item about how many people do you talk to at events, that's really more of an extroversion item. And what we found, we did look at that in this study, but we found that being extroverted wasn't helpful or harmful. It's kind of inconsequential. It's good in some ways. It actually has some negative things as well, depending on who you're talking to and what you're doing as you're talking. So extroversion, not particularly important, at least in terms of your mortality risk. But after number 1, add up all of your other ones, and your score should fall somewhere between 0, I hope you didn't get a 0, and 36 would be the top score. But then the scoring below that is what's going to give you 3 separate subscales. So if you add up what you put for number 5, 6, and 7, that is your sort of emotional support score. That's the feeling cared for component. And then if you add up 8, 9, and 10, that's the generativity component. That's the doing for others piece. And then if you add up 2, 3, and 4, that's number of interactions. That's like your network size, how frequent the interactions are. And I asked you to add those separately because what we found is that overall support was important. But we oftentimes in the literature see breakdowns, maybe looking at informational support versus something that's more concrete, like people loaning you money or bringing you food or driving you somewhere, versus emotional support. And so you see different components being differentially related to health outcomes. So when we looked at these subcategories, what we found is that feeling that you have people you can call on, feeling that other people care about you, was important. People who felt that more strongly, they indeed did live longer lives. Maybe because they were right, but really, whether they were right or wrong, the feeling was important. So that was interesting. But of the 3, this was not the strongest predictor. The strongest predictor was actually the number of interactions, that network size. So it's not, by size I don't mean necessarily just the number of people in it, but how frequently you interact. That was a better predictor of mortality risk than the feeling piece. So that's kind of, actions are speak louder than words. What you feel is important, but what actually is even more important, those actual true connections with other people. The thing that I thought was most interesting is that even though both of these 2 components predicted mortality risk. Over and above that, if people were doing things that helped others, they were doing things that gave back, they had an added bonus on top of the benefit that they were already accruing by virtue of having a big network or an active network and feeling connected to other people. So to me, because a lot of the things that we looked at in the study, although they're interesting and they do predict mortality risk, but they're relatively hard to change. Personality, I mean, you can change it, but it's not something that you decide to do on a weekend and you go sign up and do it. It takes a while. Actively engaging with our communities, doing things for others, comparatively, it's pretty easy to do. And yet it has a real benefit, not only for us, but for the other people. So one of the things that you really have to keep in mind when you're doing a study like this is that it's only one study. It happened at a particular period in time. Well, it happened over many decades, but this was a particular cohort. They were born in about 1910. They went through certain big life events together. They were mostly white. They were very smart. So that gives us advantages in certain ways because some explanations that we might initially think of, we can largely rule out. I mean, these people could understand health information. They weren't malnourished. They had access to medical care. But at the same time, it might limit generalizability because these people were different than a lot of other people. So how does it play out? So it's important to look at what other studies are finding. There aren't any studies that have looked at these kinds of variables over the same length of time that we were able to do in the longevity project. But there are a number of studies that have looked over some pretty decent periods of time and are much more diverse in terms of the sample and that have very large numbers. So they're good studies, and I want to review quickly a few of those. The Americans Changing Life Studies is a large-scale study, and what they have identified, among many other things, is that when people are more active in getting out and volunteering and doing things for others, you see a whole host of benefits. They tend to be more happy. They report being more satisfied with their lives. You see lower levels of depression, so their mental health is actually better. They have more sense of control over their lives, and their physical health is better. The Alameda County study, an even larger study, found some very similar things. So volunteers, and this was over a time period from 1974 to 1994, so a pretty nice longitudinal design. They found that the volunteers, the people who got out and did things in their community, were in better physical health and were more physically active and less depressed 20 years later. Now, this is important because of the prospective nature, because you may be thinking, well, you're out and you're volunteering more because you're healthier and you can do it. And while that may be true, in a study like this, we're looking at volunteering starting early and people being relatively the same, and we're looking at changes in individuals over time. What happened to the volunteers as a whole? Did they tend to get more or less depressed? And what about the other people who didn't volunteer over these years? Did they tend to have better or worse physical health, more or less depression, et cetera? So the prospective nature allows us to say some things that you can't say if you're not measuring over time. There was also an Australian study about the same size as our study that found that not only was volunteering related to personal well-being, but also to neighborhood well-being. So when you looked at well-being levels within a community where there were more active volunteers, you saw that the community as a whole was healthier and mentally healthier. They didn't look at physical health. My guess would be that it might be physically healthier too if you have people out planting trees, working in parks, making places that are pleasant for other people to be out in, maybe getting other people to also come and help them. You might see physical health benefits as well. It's interesting, there have been a number of studies, and I've highlighted just 3 of them here, but a number of studies have shown that particularly when we look at aging, these associations, and some studies showing actual effects in quasi-experimental designs, of volunteering and being actively involved, these are particularly potent as people get older. And again, there's a wide range of positive outcomes from satisfaction with life, less functional dependency, lower mortality risk, et cetera. But it's not only important to people as they age. So there have also been a number of studies that have looked at adolescents and youth and young people. Is it good for them? And in fact, yeah, when you look at some of even the more objective outcomes where people aren't self-reporting that they feel satisfied or that their well-being is high, but you're actually looking at things like body mass index, or you're looking at cholesterol levels or academic performance and things like that, you see real differences for kids and adolescents that get involved in their communities, that do volunteer work, versus kids who don't. So when I look at these data that are consistent from the data that we see over close to 90-year time span, what's really clear to me is that going out and grabbing life by the horns, if you will, deciding what you want to do and doing it, even if it's kind of hard, even if it's stressful, getting others involved, doing things for them, kind of pushing back selfishness a little bit and doing things is really vital. It's really important. So what kind of take-home message can we draw from this, and how do we actively engage and maybe gain some of these benefits? And I should also say, I didn't talk about this study, but there was one recent study. It was kind of interesting. It looked at volunteering and found the same kind of associations that I've been talking about. But the interesting twist is they looked at why people said they were volunteering. And for those people who were volunteering specifically to get positive outcomes for themselves, the effect wasn't there. So if you're being selfish in it and you're only doing it like, oh, I'm going to go volunteer at this dog shelter because I'm going to live longer, don't bother, because you won't. So how to engage? The first thing is to identify things about you that will be important. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Don't go volunteer doing something that you really don't enjoy because someone wants you to do it. You've got to find what fits for you, what you're good at, what you can feel satisfied with doing and really feel like you're accomplishing something. Ideally, you should volunteer in something that overlaps with your own interests. Sometimes that's not possible. You might be doing something that's really just a service. You're delivering meals, but maybe an interest of yours really is talking to people and hearing about their lives, so that it could overlap. But if you can combine not only your strengths and avoid the stuff that you really don't like, and at the same time put it with a hobby or something that you like to do anyway, and maybe now you're just doing a variant on it, that's really great. And that's more likely to be sustainable than something that's completely outside of your bailiwick and not something that you would ever really be interested in doing except for this volunteer opportunity. It's also important to do this engagement in what I call a sustainable way. So sometimes people at particular times of the year, maybe right after their birthday or after New Year's or something, people will get really excited, or they'll come in here and talk like this and be like, okay, I'm going to volunteer. But oftentimes people will take on too much at once, and then it's overwhelming. So just like we will tell people who are trying to make long-term lifestyle changes, don't change everything at once, make a little change or two, get that to be a habit, and then make another little change or two. The same thing is really true here. Don't try to say, okay, I'm going to volunteer 8 hours a week. Every Sunday, I'm going to put in, 9 to noon. You can always add to it later. If you take on too much initially, it won't be as enjoyable, probably. You may burn out, and then you give it up altogether. But if you start small, baby steps, you still have some enjoyment and some sense of satisfaction from that, and then you can always add to it. You can always ramp it up a bit. Another thing that makes it sustainable is partnering with others. So if you partner with an organization that already exists, that gives you some support and structure, some reminders, some deadlines, some people who are depending on you, and that can help kind of keep you going. But it doesn't have to be a formal organization. It can be one friend. It can be a small group of friends, and you all come together and say, look, we see this need in our community. Let's try to think of how we could address it. Here's 5 ideas. Let's try this one and see how that works. And by working together with others, you can support one another, you can share ideas, you can comfort each other when stuff doesn't go as planned, and that also tends to make it more sustainable.